My name is Jodie Bretherton and I will be discussing the historical Tent Embassy protests, their effects on the lives of Indigenous Australians and the relevance of this event for teaching and learning in Australia. Firstly, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as traditional owners of this land and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and the elders from other communities who may be here today. On the 26th of January 1972, 4 Indigenous men set up a beach umbrella on the lawns opposite Parliament House in Canberra. According to the National Museum of Australia, they were there to protest against the McMahon government's approach to Indigenous land rights. When Justice Blackburn ruled that native title was not part of Australian law, Indigenous communities Australia-wide were outraged. Protesters described their umbrella as the Aboriginal Embassy because, in the words of Gary Foley, we felt like aliens in our own land. So, like other aliens, we needed an embassy. The embassy quickly gained support from both international diplomats and official Indigenous groups, and support from well-known Aboriginal activists helped the movement to gain wide attention across Australia and internationally. ABC News recalls that the movement quickly gained traction with more and more tents being erected and numbers at one point swelling to 2,000. A loophole in the law allowed the tent embassy to remain until new laws were passed in 1972, making it illegal to camp on unleased land in the ACT and giving the government powers to forcibly remove anyone found to be in breach of the ordinance. In violent fights, protesters clashed with police, the tents were torn down and many protesters were arrested. According to the socialist group Solidarity, the tent embassy showed that a protest movement that is set out to confront the government could put Aboriginal rights on the agenda and win real changes. This presentation will discuss how the tent embassy protests have changed the lives of Indigenous Australians and reflect on why it is important for educators to understand this and other historical Indigenous events. I will also discuss how the current curriculum recognises Indigenous perspectives and how we as educators can achieve quality pedagogy that does not recreate stereotypical representations of Aboriginal people. The 1970s were a period of some of the most important gains in the history of Aboriginal politics. According to the National Museum of Australia, on the 6th of February 1972, the Embassy issued a list of demands to the Australian government. The list focused on land rights issues. When the opposition leader Gough Whitlam visited the site, many saw this as recognition for the cause. According to the Australian Politics website, the Whitlam Labor government's It's Time campaign saw them win power at the end of 1972, largely on the back of social movements, including the Aboriginal rights movement. Whitlam dropped the charges against activists over the tent embassy protests and abolished assimilation as official policy, creating the first Department of Aboriginal Affairs. His government also drew up the Northern Territory Land Rights Act that was eventually passed under the Liberal Fraser government, giving Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory their land back. These steps were significant for Aboriginal people and showed the power of political protest to win gains. Interestingly, throughout my own education, I had not heard of the tent embassy, or perhaps I had heard of it, but the knowledge of its existence had not weighted significantly enough that I retained any information about the event or its purpose or outcomes. I have to ask myself, why is this? Why is it that such a significant event in Australia's history could simply be missing from my 20 years of education? Perhaps Kay Price provides an answer to this question. Her discussion of the silent apartheid talks about the emergence of educators from university who have had little exposure to Indigenous insights. She discusses how these educators inadvertently replicate this ignorance by teaching nothing at all about Indigenous cultures, or worse, teaching illegitimate or ill-informed Indigenous content. Harrison and Greenfield identify this ignorance as common, affirming that teachers often claim they know little about Aboriginal people. Noel Pearson uses this point to argue that non-Indigenous teachers should not be teaching about Aboriginal perspectives because they teach children stereotypes of Aboriginality. However, Harrison and Greenfield contend that it is important for educators to learn about significant events in Aboriginal history and understand Indigenous perspectives so that teachers can achieve authentic education without stereotypical representations. Kay Price agrees, highlighting the educator's role as social architects that should not be underestimated. When recalling the historical significance of the Tent Embassy, Kelly, 2013, questions why these events are still not part of popular knowledge of who we are as Australians. She asks, without this knowledge, how can we understand Australian history and contemporary circumstances? How can educators include Indigenous themes in their curriculum at the same time as we are living in a country where Aboriginal people are still unrecognised within the Constitution and do not have a recognised role to play in the building of our nation? The Australian curriculum recognises the importance for all students to deepen their knowledge of Australia by engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, and tries to address this issue by setting out a conceptual framework for educators within the curriculum. However, Harrison and Greenfield caution that Aboriginal knowledge is not something that can be packaged within a unit of work and taught out of context. Quality teaching of Aboriginal perspectives is contingent upon the teacher's conceptualisation of Aboriginal knowledge. Buckskin, 2015, states, if in a school Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are only celebrated during NAIDOC Week, on Mabo Day, on National Reconciliation Week, or by having students do dot paintings or having local community members teaching dance or painting children's faces, what does this teach students and the community about contemporary life? Price refers to populistic stereotypical symbolism of Indigenous culture as exoticism, stating that a warped paradigm of the real Aborigine is fed by a lack of historical perspective and an ingrained misconception that Indigenous Australians are homogeneous. She cautions that stereotyping Indigenous culture questions the identity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and that although the frame of exoticism offers a certain level of respect, the practitioner, through ignorance, excludes and alienates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as well as perpetuating distorted beliefs about their lives, both past and present. So, what does quality pedagogy look like that does not recreate stereotypical representations of Aboriginal people? Harrison and Greenfield argue that quality pedagogy in Aboriginal contexts must include more than a phone call to an Aboriginal dance agency or painting a mural on a school wall. They discuss the need for schools to make serious and ongoing contact with Aboriginal people in their community. Lev Vygotsky's theory that learning occurs as social context agrees with this pedagogical approach to Indigenous education. Vygotsky's ideas about social, cultural and social historical influences on pedagogical development is also supported by Price, who argues that culturally competent education fosters engagement with and participation by local Indigenous communities and builds positive learning relationships with Indigenous children. thus delivering authentic social, cultural and historical Indigenous education. We as teachers have an opportunity to close the gap on the socio-economic disadvantage experienced by many Indigenous Australians. As social architects that should not be underestimated, it is up to us as educators to increase all Australians' understandings about Indigenous histories and cultures, and that is why it is important for all educators to gain a respectful understanding of Indigenous cultures, histories and perspectives. Thank you.